4 weeks into this war, the United States military has done something that hasn't happened since Vietnam. We've run out of ammunition, not bullets, not artillery shells, Tomahawk cruise missiles, the backbone of American power projection. 850 of them fired in just 4 weeks. My sources inside the Pentagon tell me we're now at what's called Winchester, military speak for a weapon system that has expended all its ammunition. And here's what they're not telling you. We can only manufacture a few hundred of these missiles per year. It takes months to build a single Tomahawk. We just burned through multiple years of inventory in 1 month, and Iran is still fighting. Let me explain what this means, because the mainstream media isn't covering it properly. They're showing you footage of explosions in Tehran. They're running Pentagon press briefings about successful strikes, but they're not telling you about the crisis that's happening behind the scenes. A crisis that threatens not just this war with Iran, but America's ability to project power anywhere in the world. The Tomahawk missile has been the cornerstone of American military operations for decades. It's a subsonic cruise missile that can fly over 1,000 miles, navigate around terrain, and hit targets with precision. It's what allows us to strike enemy infrastructure without putting pilots at risk. During the Gulf War, we used them in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan and Iraq, in Syria against ISIS. They're the weapon system that presidents reach for when they want to demonstrate American military power without risking American lives. But here's the problem. We never anticipated using them at this rate. In a typical year, we might fire a few dozen in combat operations, maybe 100 in a major campaign. The Defense Industrial Base, the companies that manufacture these systems, is tooled to produce somewhere between 200 and 400 Tomahawks annually, depending on funding and production schedules. Now do the math. 850 fired in 4 weeks. That's more than 2 full years of maximum production capacity burned through in a single month. And we're only 4 weeks into this war. At this rate, we'll have exhausted our entire stockpile before summer. My sources tell me that Navy ships conducting strikes in the Persian Gulf have already received orders to return to friendly ports for emergency ammunition resupply operations. That's unprecedented. Normally, naval vessels operate for months at a time before needing to rearm. But when you're firing dozens of cruise missiles per day, you burn through your magazines fast, and it gets worse, because the Tomahawk isn't the only system we're depleting. We're also burning through air-launched cruise missiles, joint air-to-surface standoff missiles, precision-guided bombs, all the smart munitions that modern warfare depends on. Every single one of these systems has the same problem. They're expensive, they're complex, and they take a long time to manufacture. The Pentagon is now facing what defense analysts call a magazine depth problem. We have incredible weapons systems. Our technology is generations ahead of most adversaries, but we don't have enough of them to sustain high-intensity combat operations for extended periods. We built a military designed for quick, decisive victories, shock and awe, overwhelming force. Get in, destroy the target, get out. We didn't build a military designed for sustained attrition warfare. Iran, on the other hand, has been preparing for exactly this kind of fight. They know they can't match us missile for missile or aircraft for aircraft, so they've invested in mass production of cheap systems, drones that cost maybe $30,000 each, simple ballistic missiles that cost a fraction of what a Tomahawk costs. They've built their entire military doctrine around the idea that they can overwhelm us through sheer numbers. And here's the cruel irony, it's working. We're spending millions of dollars per strike. They're responding with weapons that cost thousands. We're depleting irreplaceable high-tech systems. They're churning out drones and missiles from factories that can scale production quickly. This is asymmetric warfare perfected, not at the tactical level, but at the industrial level. Let me give you some specific numbers that illustrate the problem. A single Tomahawk missile costs about $2 million when you factor in all the associated costs. 850 missiles fired means we've spent approximately $1.7 billion just on Tomahawks. That doesn't count the other munitions. That doesn't count the operational costs of the aircraft carriers, the support vessels, the logistics chain, just the missiles themselves. Meanwhile, Iran is producing Shahed 136 drones, the kind they've been using against our forces, for somewhere between $20,000 to $30,000 each. They can manufacture hundreds of these per month. For the cost of one Tomahawk, Iran can produce almost 70 drones. Think about that ratio. Think about what it means for sustained combat operations. The Pentagon has recognized this problem. That's why they've made a dramatic shift in strategy. My sources tell me that CENTCOM has moved away from relying exclusively on expensive cruise missiles and has started deploying what they're calling cheap mass systems. Essentially, they're copying Iran's playbook. The military has developed a drone called Lucas, a reverse-engineered version of Iran's Shahed design, made in America, cheap, expendable. The idea is to use hundreds or even thousands of these low-cost drones to overwhelm Iranian air defenses, saving the expensive missiles for high-value targets that absolutely require precision. But here's the problem with that strategy. We're not good at making cheap things quickly. Our defense industrial base is optimized for producing small quantities of very sophisticated, very expensive systems. Retooling to mass-produce cheap drones at scale, that takes time. It takes investment. It takes a complete rethinking of how we do defense procurement. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking. Iran keeps fighting, and every day that passes, our magazine depth gets shallower. My sources tell me there are now active discussions at the highest levels of the Pentagon about what happens if we run out of precision munitions entirely. What's the backup plan? Do we resort to less precise weapons? Do we accept higher collateral damage? Do we put pilots at greater risk by sending them closer to targets? These are questions that should have been answered before the war started, but they weren't, because the assumption was that Iran would collapse quickly under the weight of American firepower. That hasn't happened. Iran's leadership is decapitated, yes. Their military infrastructure is heavily damaged, but they're still functioning. They're still launching attacks. They're still fighting. And here's what really concerns me. This ammunition crisis doesn't just affect the war with Iran. It affects every other potential conflict on the horizon. China's watching this very carefully. They're taking notes on how quickly America burns through its stockpiles. They're observing our industrial production rates. They're calculating how long we could sustain combat operations in a Taiwan scenario. Right now, because of this war with Iran, our deterrence posture in the Indo-Pacific has been significantly weakened. We don't have the ammunition reserves to fight a major war with China while simultaneously dealing with Iran. And Chinese military planners know this. They're watching our magazine depth shrink in real time. The same goes for Russia. The same goes for North Korea. Every adversary and potential adversary is observing this conflict and drawing conclusions about American military sustainability. And those conclusions are not favorable to us. Now, you might ask, why can't we just build more missiles faster? It's a reasonable question. The answer reveals fundamental problems with how we've structured our defense industrial base over the last few decades. First, there's the supply chain issue. A Tomahawk missile contains thousands of components sourced from hundreds of suppliers. Some of these components come from sole source vendors, companies that are the only manufacturer of that specific part. If one of those vendors has a production bottleneck, the entire missile production line slows down. We've consolidated our defense industrial base so much that we've created fragility. Second, there's the skilled workforce problem. Building precision missiles requires highly trained technicians, specialized manufacturing capabilities. You can't just hire people off the street and teach them to assemble guidance systems in a week. The expertise takes years to develop, and we've been steadily eroding that workforce for decades as defense budgets fluctuated and production contracts came and went. Third, there's the tooling and facilities issue. The factories that produce these missiles are specialized facilities. They're not easily expanded or replicated. Building a new production line takes years and costs billions. Even if Congress appropriated the money today, we wouldn't see increased production for years. So we're stuck. We're in the middle of a war that's consuming our most critical munitions faster than we can replace them. And the fixes, even if we started implementing them immediately, wouldn't bear fruit for years. My sources tell me there have been emergency classified briefings on Capitol Hill. Senior Pentagon officials explaining to key congressional leaders just how serious this ammunition crisis has become. The conversations are blunt, the projections are alarming, and the political implications are staggering. This is what happens when you build a military based on the assumption of quick, decisive wars. When you optimize for shock and awe rather than sustained operations. When you prioritize technology over mass. We've created a military that's incredibly capable for the first few weeks of a conflict, but if the enemy doesn't fold quickly, we start running into fundamental sustainability problems. And Iran knows this. They've studied American military operations for decades. They understand our strengths and our weaknesses. They know that if they can survive the initial onslaught, if they can absorb the punishment and keep fighting, eventually we run into logistics problems. Eventually we start making difficult trade-offs. Eventually the economic and industrial realities catch up with us. My sources tell me that Iranian military planners have been explicit about this in their doctrine. They call it strategic patience. The idea is not to defeat America in open combat. That's impossible. The idea is to survive long enough that the costs of the war become unsustainable for Washington, to make the war so expensive, so grinding, so difficult to sustain that eventually political pressure forces a settlement on terms favorable to Iran. It's the same strategy that worked against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the same strategy that worked against the United States in Vietnam and in Afghanistan. It's not about winning battles. It's about not losing long enough that the stronger power gives up. And right now, with our Tomahawk stockpiles depleting and our production capacity unable to keep pace with consumption, Iran's strategy is working. Not because they're militarily defeating us, but because the industrial and economic math doesn't work in our favor. The American people need to understand what's happening. This isn't just about one weapon system. This is about the fundamental sustainability of our military posture. We've built armed forces that are optimized for a specific type of warfare, short, intense, technology-dominated conflicts against adversaries who will quickly fold under pressure. But when we face an adversary who's willing to absorb punishment and keep fighting, who's willing to trade cheap systems for our expensive ones, the equations start looking very different. And here's the really uncomfortable question that needs to be asked. What happens when the next crisis erupts? What happens if North Korea decides this is the moment to move on South Korea? What happens if China decides now is the time to pressure Taiwan? What happens if Russia sees this as an opportunity for further aggression? We're engaged in a single theater with Iran, and we're already running into ammunition shortages. How would we handle multiple simultaneous crises? The answer is we couldn't, not with current stockpiles, not with current production rates. We'd be forced to make hard choices about which conflicts to prioritize and which allies to potentially abandon. This is the strategic reality that nobody in Washington wants to talk about publicly. But behind closed doors at the Pentagon, at CENTCOM, in the White House Situation Room, these conversations are happening. There's growing recognition that we may have overextended ourselves, that we may have started a war without fully thinking through the industrial and logistical requirements of actually winning it. The mainstream media will keep showing you explosions. They'll keep reporting Pentagon statements about successful strikes. They'll keep maintaining the narrative that everything is going according to plan. But my sources are telling me a very different story, a story about emergency ammunition resupply operations, about ships returning to port to rearm, about production lines running at maximum capacity but still not keeping pace with consumption, about growing concern that we're burning through irreplaceable stockpiles to fight a war that isn't producing decisive results. This is the Winchester crisis, and it's only going to get worse unless something changes dramatically. Either Iran collapses sooner than expected, or we find a way to dramatically scale up production, or we accept that we're going to have to fight this war differently. With less reliance on expensive precision systems, with more risk to our personnel, with potentially higher collateral damage, none of those are good options. But they may be the only options we have left because the ammunition is running out, and Iran knows it. Let me break down exactly what the Winchester crisis means in practical terms, because this isn't just an abstract problem. This affects real operations happening right now in the Persian Gulf. When a Navy destroyer or cruiser goes into combat, it carries a finite number of missiles in its vertical launch cells. A typical Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries 96 cells. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser carries 122. Those cells hold a mix of weapons: Tomahawks for striking land targets, SM-2 and SM-6 missiles for air defense, anti-submarine rockets. In normal peacetime operations, those magazines stay mostly full for months at a time. The ship might fire 1 or 2 missiles during an entire deployment for training, or if there's a specific threat that needs to be engaged. But in this war, ships are emptying their magazines in days. My sources tell me that some vessels have fired 30 or 40 Tomahawks in less than a week. When that happens, the ship becomes operationally limited. It can't conduct further strikes. Its defensive capabilities are reduced. It has to withdraw from the combat zone and return to a friendly port for rearming. That process takes time, usually days, sometimes weeks, depending on the port facilities and the availability of missiles. During that time, that ship is out of the fight. That's one less platform contributing to the campaign. Now multiply that across the entire fleet operating in the region. Multiple ships cycling in and out for rearming at any given time. The operational tempo suffers. The sustained pressure on Iranian targets decreases. And Iran gets breathing room to reconstitute its forces, repair damage, and plan counterstrikes. This is exactly what happened in the early days of the Ukraine war when Russian forces ran into ammunition problems. Their artillery battalions were firing shells at unsustainable rates. When the stockpiles started running low, their offensive operations stalled. Units that had been advancing aggressively suddenly became defensive. The entire momentum of the war shifted because of logistics. We're seeing the same pattern now, just with different weapon systems. The Pentagon talks about continuing operations and maintaining pressure, but behind the scenes, commanders are having to make difficult decisions about ammunition allocation. Which targets are worth a Tomahawk? Which ones can wait? Which ones can be struck with less expensive means? This brings us to the Lucas drone program, which represents a fundamental admission that our current approach isn't working. Lucas stands for Low-Cost Unmanned Combat Aerial System. It's essentially a knockoff of Iran's Shahed 136 drone. One-way attack drone, cheap to produce, meant to be used in swarms to overwhelm enemy defenses. The Pentagon has contracted with several companies to produce thousands of these drones. The goal is to have systems that cost maybe $50,000 to $70,000 each instead of $2 million. Systems that can be manufactured quickly using readily available components. Systems that we can afford to lose because they're expendable. But here's the challenge. We're not organizationally or industrially set up to do cheap and fast. Our entire defense procurement system is built around the opposite philosophy, expensive and slow, but highly capable. Changing that mindset, changing those processes, changing those contracts. It's like trying to turn an aircraft carrier around in a bathtub. The companies that make Tomahawks, Raytheon being the primary contractor, have perfected the art of building small numbers of very sophisticated systems. Their factories, their supply chains, their workforce, their quality control processes, everything is optimized for that model. Asking them to suddenly start churning out thousands of cheap drones is like asking Ferrari to start mass-producing economy cars. It's a completely different business model. Meanwhile, Iran and its proxies are already mass-producing cheap drones. They've been doing it for years. Their industrial base is tooled for it. Their supply chains support it. They can scale production up or down relatively easily. This is their home turf, both literally in terms of geography and figuratively in terms of industrial strategy. And this gets to the heart of a deeper strategic problem. We've spent decades building what we call a peer competitor military, forces designed to fight a high-tech war against another major power, Russia or China. Exquisite systems designed to win in extremely challenging environments against sophisticated adversaries. But Iran isn't fighting that war. They're fighting an asymmetric war. They're using cheap systems in large numbers. They're targeting our logistics. They're exploiting the fact that our expensive weapons are in limited supply. They're playing a completely different game than the one we prepared for. This is what military strategists call fighting to your strengths and your enemy's weaknesses. Iran knows they can't beat us in a fair fight with comparable weapons. So they're not trying to fight fairly. They're creating a situation where our technological advantages don't translate into strategic victory because we can't sustain the operations long enough. Think about it this way. If you're in a knife fight and you have a really high quality knife, but your opponent has 100 cheap knives, who has the advantage? Yes, your knife is better, but if the fight goes on long enough, eventually the sheer numbers overwhelm quality. That's the war we're in. We have incredible systems, Tomahawks that can fly 1,000 miles and hit a window. But Iran has thousands of drones that don't need to be that precise. They just need to keep coming. And we're discovering that quality times small quantity doesn't always beat mediocrity times large quantity. My sources tell me there's genuine alarm at senior levels about this. Not panic yet, but serious concern, because this problem extends beyond just missiles. We're also running low on certain types of precision-guided bombs, on specific electronic warfare systems, on replacement parts for aircraft that are flying sortie after sortie in harsh conditions. The entire logistics chain is being stressed in ways that peacetime planning didn't fully account for, and the more we dig into it, the more we discover vulnerabilities. Supply chains with single points of failure, critical components with lead times measured in months, specialized equipment with limited global availability. This is what happens when you fight a real war instead of a limited operation. All the theoretical limitations become actual limitations. All the things that look fine on paper turn out to be problems in practice. All the assumptions about how the enemy will behave turn out to be wrong. Iran is not rolling over. They're not suing for peace. They're absorbing the punishment and continuing to fight. And every day they survive, every week this war continues, our strategic position deteriorates slightly. Not because we're losing battles, but because the economic and industrial math increasingly favors the side that can sustain operations longer. This is the conversation that needs to happen publicly. This is what Congress should be debating. This is what the American people need to understand. We're in a war that we may not be able to sustain at current intensity levels, not because our military isn't capable, but because our defense industrial base isn't structured to support this kind of sustained high-tempo operations. And the solutions aren't quick or easy. We can't just throw money at the problem and expect it to go away. Even if Congress appropriated billions for missile production tomorrow, it would take years to build new factories, train new workers, establish new supply chains. The fixes have very long lead times. In the short term, we're stuck with the inventory we have, which means commanders are going to have to get creative, which means accepting more risk, which means potentially changing how we fight this war. And all of that happens while Iran continues to operate, continues to strike back, continues to demonstrate that they can survive American military power if they're willing to pay the price. The Winchester crisis is real. The ammunition's running out, and the enemy is still standing. That should tell you everything you need to know about where this war is actually headed. Let me give you critical context. Gulf War 1991, 300 Tomahawks fired over 6 weeks. Massive expenditure demonstrating American technological superiority. It worked. Iraq's military decimated, Saddam driven from Kuwait. This war with Iran, 850 Tomahawks in 4 weeks. Almost 3 times Gulf War total in 1/3 the time. Result, Iran still functioning, still launching attacks. Government hasn't collapsed. Military continues operating despite heavy damage. Fundamental miscalculation. Pentagon assumed Iran would respond like Iraq 1991. That overwhelming firepower would produce rapid collapse. Wrong. Iran spent 30 years studying how America fights. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. They analyzed tactics, weapons, operational patterns, designed entire military posture around surviving initial assault, then making war too costly to continue. Their strategy forced us to expend expensive weapons against cheap targets. Every $2 million Tomahawk destroying a $50,000 drone facility, Iran wins economically. Every precision munition against dispersed, hardened, quickly rebuilt targets plays into attrition strategy. Iranian military doctrine explicitly discusses defensive deterrence through strategic exhaustion, make war so expensive, resource-consuming, difficult to sustain, that domestic political pressure forces Washington to settle, leaving Iranian regime intact. It's working. 4 weeks in, ammunition shortages, tactics changing, looking at alternative systems because decades-old reliance depleting faster than replacement. And we're not just competing with Iran, we're competing with our own history. Every missile fired now unavailable for next crisis. Every smart bomb used is one less for Taiwan, Korea, whatever erupts next. Mortgaging future military capability for present war without decisive results. China watching closely. Military strategists taking extensive notes. Observing America brings overwhelming firepower in opening weeks but struggles sustaining intensity. Expensive precision weapons deplete quickly. In Taiwan's scenario, if they survive first month of strikes, our operational capabilities decline significantly. This is intelligence you can't buy, steal, or simulate. Real-world operational data about American sustainability. We're exposing vulnerabilities in real time, free training for potential adversaries, Russia watching too, observing consumption rates, logistics performance under stress, learning from mistakes, adjusting strategies. Every day this continues, we're conducting free training for future adversaries. Core problem, we built military for wrong war, optimized for short, decisive conflicts against conventional adversaries, assumed technological superiority produces quick victories, didn't plan for enemies refusing to fold, adopting strategies negating our advantages, now paying price. War consuming ammunition faster than production. Enemy using our philosophy against us. Planning, investments, sophisticated systems don't mean much if underlying industrial capacity can't sustain them. Pentagon knows Sources tell me intensive real-time after-action reviews underway, analyzing what went wrong, why consumption exceeded projections, how enemy adapted, what needs changing. But reviews won't produce more Tomahawks, won't expand defense industrial base, won't solve current crisis in Persian Gulf. Uncomfortable truth about modern American military power, incredibly capable for brief periods, devastating strikes, air superiority, battlefield dominance. But if conflict extends beyond first few weeks, if enemy survives initial onslaught, we hit fundamental limitations no tactical brilliance overcomes. The ammunition crisis is real. The Winchester status is real. Unless something changes dramatically, Iran collapses, production scales, strategy fundamentally alters, this worsens before improving. The missiles are running out, and the war continues. That's the reality nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge publicly. This is what happens when you fight a determined adversary with limited resources against unlimited resolve and patience. The math doesn't work, and everyone knows it. Winchester means empty, and we're almost there. The missiles are gone. The enemy remains standing. History will remember this strategic failure,